policeman in a park notices a black man just sitting on a bench. He decides that the man should not be here and demands that he leave. When the man refuses, the officer loses patience and uses force. But in just a second, he realizes that he has made the biggest miscalculation of his life. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The midday sun hung high in the sky, casting golden light over the sprawling city park. The heat was tempered by a gentle breeze, rustling through the leaves of towering oak and maple trees. Laughter echoed from a nearby playground, where children climbed jungle gyms and raced each other across the soft grass. Couples strolled leisurely along winding paths, their hands intertwined. Elderly men sat at chess tables, moving pieces with slow, deliberate precision, pausing only to sip from bottles of water or to exchange knowing glances with their opponents. Joggers moved in steady rhythms, their breathing synchronizing with the measured beat of their footsteps against the pavement. Near the park's main fountain, a group of teenagers gathered around a portable speaker, nodding to the bass-heavy rhythm of a hip-hop track. Pigeons flapped their wings noisily as an elderly woman scattered crumbs near a shaded bench where she had been feeding them for years. Everything about this place hummed with life, with the simple, unassuming pleasures of a warm afternoon in the city. And yet, amidst all this movement and sound, a lone figure sat quietly on a bench beneath the shade of an old willow tree, seemingly detached from the world around him. Muhammad Ali sat with his hands folded in his lap, his back straight, his breathing slow and steady. He wore a crisp white button-up shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and a pair of light khaki trousers. His sneakers, well-worn but clean, rested firmly against the pavement. A baseball cap shaded his face, its brim pulled low enough to obscure his features from a casual glance. Despite the years that had passed, the great fighter still carried an unmistakable presence. His broad shoulders, though slightly hunched with age, still conveyed strength. His hands, those legendary hands, rested motionless, the tremors barely noticeable except to the trained eye. Parkinson's had claimed much from him, but not his dignity, not his spirit. Few people passing by recognized him immediately. The years had changed him. The brash, confident warrior of the ring had aged into a man of quiet resilience. Some who did recognize him hesitated, unsure whether to approach. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a symbol, an icon, a living testament to endurance and defiance. Most chose to leave him be, sensing that he had come here not for attention, but for peace. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the park wash over him, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythmic chatter of children, the soft hum of passing conversations. This place was one of the few where he could simply exist, without the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Then came the footsteps. They were firm, deliberate, the sound of heavy boots striking pavement with the kind of authority that sought to be noticed. The rhythm of them didn't match the casual strolls of the park's visitors. These were the steps of someone with purpose, someone used to taking up space, demanding attention. Ali remained still, though he was aware of the man before he even came into view. He had trained himself to be aware, to sense shifts in the atmosphere, changes in the energy of a place. It was an instinct honed through years of battles, both inside and outside the ring. The footsteps stopped a few feet away. Muhammad Ali opened his eyes. A police officer stood before him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and a permanent sneer etched into his face. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. The belt around his waist carried the usual tools of his trade: a radio, handcuffs, a pistol secured in its holster, and, most prominently, a black baton hanging at his side. Officer Kane. Kane had spent years patrolling this park, though he didn't see himself as a protector. He relished the power his uniform gave him, the way people tensed under his gaze, the way they hurried out of his path when he walked through their space. He liked order. He liked control. And he especially liked reminding people, certain people, of their place. He had been watching Ali for the past few minutes, observing the older man sitting alone, not moving, not talking to anyone. Something about him irritated Kane. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in his posture, the way he didn't fidget under the officer's scrutiny. Maybe it was just the fact that he was there at all. Kane didn't recognize him. He didn't see a world champion, a cultural icon, a man who had stood toe-to-toe with history itself. He saw an old black man sitting alone on a bench, and that was enough. The air between them shifted. Kane adjusted his belt, his fingers grazing the handle of his baton as he took another step forward. The tension in the air was invisible to most, but palpable to those who understood such moments. Some passers-by glanced toward the scene, sensing the brewing conflict but hesitating to interfere. Others simply walked past, their own lives moving too quickly for them to notice. Muhammad Ali said nothing. He simply looked at the officer, his expression unreadable. Not afraid, not angry, just watching. Kane's lips curled into a smirk. He enjoyed that, making people feel small, forcing them to react, to cower. He had done it before, countless times, and it never failed to bring him satisfaction. But there was something about the way this old man looked at him that sent an irritation crawling up his spine. There was no fear in those eyes, no uncertainty. Kane's hand tightened slightly around the baton at his side. The great fighter remained still. The park, still buzzing with its usual activity, seemed unaware of the moment unfolding beneath the willow tree. But it was there, a storm waiting to break. The silence that had enveloped the bench was abruptly shattered by the steady, authoritative clack of heavy boots on the pavement. Officer Kane, emboldened by his own sense of entitlement, stepped closer to Muhammad Ali with deliberate strides. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Ali's calm expression as if to measure every flicker of resistance. Kane's mind churned with assumptions, his prejudices painting a picture of a man who did not belong, a man who dared to claim a public space without conforming to the officer's narrow idea of order. His presence was imposing, a self-appointed arbiter of who could exist in this sanctuary of leisure. Kane stopped just inches away from Ali. His gaze was unyielding, his sneer twisting into a mask of contempt. Without any preamble or formal introduction, the officer's tone was sharp and laced with disdain. "Explain yourself," he barked, his words carrying the weight of authority that he believed justified his intrusion. The command hung in the warm air, a challenge to the quiet dignity that Ali had cultivated over decades of struggle and triumph. Ali's eyes met Kane's with an inscrutable calm. He did not respond, his silence a quiet rebuke that unsettled the officer. The moment seemed to stretch indefinitely, filled with the unspoken tension of two forces destined to collide. The park around them, filled with the murmurs of daily life, began to fade into a background hum as the focus narrowed onto the impending clash. Kane's nostrils flared as he took in the sight of the aging man, his posture unassuming yet resolute, his gaze unwavering despite the threat in front of him. Kane's irritation mounted with every passing second. His mind raced with bitter judgments. Here was a man who, in Kane's eyes, was encroaching upon territory he did not deserve to occupy. The officer's thoughts were clouded by prejudice, his perception skewed by years of unchecked authority. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice barely concealing the contempt that simmered beneath the surface. Each word was delivered with a deliberate emphasis meant to belittle, as if every syllable was a reminder of the power that his uniform bestowed upon him. Ali's silence remained unbroken. His face was a portrait of serene determination, a man who had seen much in life and yet had learned that silence could sometimes speak louder than any retort. The quiet in his eyes, however, did not equate to submission. On the contrary, it was a calm before the storm. A calm born of years of hardship and the inner resolve that had carried him through countless battles, both in the ring and out in the world. The tension escalated as Kane's irritation turned into outright anger. His hand moved slowly, almost ceremonially, toward the baton that hung at his side, a symbol of the power he wielded and, in his mind, the justification for his actions. The officer's grip tightened around the handle, the leather creaking under the pressure as if echoing the strain in his heart. His mind, already clouded with disdain, saw Ali's quiet defiance as a challenge that could not go unanswered. "You need to leave," Kane declared, his voice rising with an edge that bordered on threat. The words fell heavy, an ultimatum that carried the weight of the law as interpreted by a man who was convinced of his own righteousness. Yet, in that moment, the law was not a tool for justice, but an instrument of his own unchecked prejudice. Kane's eyes flicked between the calm figure on the bench and the growing crowd of onlookers who had begun to sense that something was about to erupt. As the murmurs of the crowd grew, Kane's resolve wavered between his desire to assert dominance and the gnawing uncertainty that had begun to creep into his thoughts. Ali, for his part, remained motionless, a statue of dignity in the face of injustice. The standoff was both surreal and terrifying. It was as if time had slowed, allowing every detail to be etched into the memory of those present. Kane's next words were harsher, more forceful, and imbued with an aggressive finality. "I said, get up and leave," he roared, his voice echoing off the nearby trees. The command was not so much a request as it was a declaration of war, a declaration that anyone who defied the officer's narrow view of order was an enemy of that order, and, by extension, of the state itself. The intensity in Kane's eyes grew, his features contorting with the fury of a man who believed he was fighting an uphill battle against the forces of chaos. In the charged atmosphere of the park, the physical space between the two men seemed to shrink. Every heartbeat pounded in the ears of the onlookers as they witnessed a conflict that transcended the ordinary, a collision of power and dignity, authority and defiance. Ali's silence was no longer just a quiet refusal. It was an act of peaceful protest, a refusal to engage in the baseless aggression of a man who saw him only through the lens of bias. Kane, however, was unyielding in his quest to force compliance. His eyes darted around, as if seeking the support of invisible forces that would validate his actions. The murmurs of the crowd began to swell into a cacophony of uncertainty and anticipation, each person waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. Yet, in the midst of the growing tumult, Ali remained unmoved, a beacon of unspoken strength amidst the storm of anger and prejudice. Then, as if the tension had reached its breaking point, Kane made the fateful decision that would ignite the spark of rebellion. In one swift, unthinking motion, he drew his baton from its holster. The movement was abrupt and violent, a stark contrast to the slow, measured passage of time moments before. Without any warning, the baton came crashing down towards Ali's head, a blow that would shatter the fragile veneer of peace that had hitherto cloaked the park. The sound of the impact was deafening in its finality, a sickening thud that seemed to echo in every direction. For an instant, the world around them paused as if paying homage to the brutality of that single, irreversible moment. The blow landed squarely on Allie's head, a violent punctuation to the officer's tirade. Allie's eyes widened for a split second, a flash of pain and shock crossing his features, but that expression was quickly replaced by an unyielding resolve. The park, once a haven of tranquility and everyday life, had become a stage for a confrontation that spoke of deeper, unspoken struggles. The crowd's reaction was instantaneous. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gathered onlookers, and, in the midst of it all, a palpable sense of disbelief took hold. Phones were lifted, recording devices activated, as witnesses struggled to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. Yet, even as the physical blow was dealt, the true impact was yet to be measured. Ali, though struck, did not crumble. Instead, he remained seated for a long moment, his hand slowly reaching up to the spot where the baton had struck. His touch was gentle, almost tender, as if he were trying to soothe not just the physical pain, but the sting of an injustice that had been inflicted upon him. There was a solemn dignity in that gesture, a silent acknowledgement that, despite the violence, he was not broken. The officer's face contorted with a mixture of anger and triumph, convinced that his act had restored order, that he had demonstrated his authority in a manner that would quell any further defiance. Yet, even as Kane's eyes gleamed with a fleeting sense of victory, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of something greater stirring beneath the surface. The blow had been administered, but in that same moment, the spirit of resistance was ignited. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, shifting from shock to indignation. Some onlookers began to exchange glances filled with silent solidarity, recognizing that the act of aggression was not an isolated incident but a manifestation of a deeper, systemic injustice. There was a collective recognition that what they had witnessed was not just the abuse of power by one man, but a symptom of a far larger malaise. In hushed whispers, people spoke of accountability and the need to stand up against such behavior, a sentiment that resonated deeply with those who had come to the park seeking peace and community. Kane, still reeling from his own display of force, took a step back. His chest heaved with labored breaths as the adrenaline of the moment began to subside, replaced by a dawning realization that something unexpected had transpired. His mind raced to justify his actions, to convince himself that this was the only way to maintain order, even as the evidence of his own brutality stared him in the face. In his eyes, the world was now divided into those who obeyed and those who defied, a division that, in his limited view, justified his every move. For Ali, the impact of the baton was both physical and symbolic, a harsh reminder of the world's cruelty, but also a catalyst that would awaken the warrior within. His blood, slowly trickling down from the wound, became a silent testament to the injustice he had endured, yet it also spoke of a resilience that would not be easily extinguished. With a deep, measured breath, he began to steady himself, each movement deliberate and imbued with a sense of purpose that belied his age and apparent vulnerability. In that charged moment, as the park held its collective breath, the confrontation had reached a critical juncture. The silence that followed was not one of submission, but of anticipation, a pregnant pause in which the fate of both men hung in the balance. Kane's authority, once so unquestioned, now trembled on the edge of collapse in the face of Ali's unyielding spirit. The officer's rage, so meticulously cultivated over years of unchecked power, was now challenged by the quiet, formidable resistance of a man who had already endured much more than this single, violent act. The space between them crackled with the electricity of impending consequences. Every detail, the sheen of sweat on Cain's brow, the determined set of Ali's jaw, the collective heartbeat of the gathered crowd contributed to a tableau that was as inevitable as it was tragic. In that moment, it was clear that the conflict was not merely about a single act of aggression. It was a collision of two worlds. One world, represented by Cain, was built on the fragile edifice of authority and control, a world that demanded conformity at any cost. The other world, embodied by Ali, was one of dignity and quiet defiance, a world that recognized the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of age or appearance. As the echoes of the baton's impact faded, Cain's face twisted into a snarl of anger and disbelief. His eyes darted around, searching for an ally in the indifferent crowd, while Ali's calm gaze, now tinged with a hint of pain, conveyed a message that was clear and unyielding. This act of violence would not go unanswered. It was a turning point, a moment that would reverberate far beyond the boundaries of this sunlit park. For the officer, the brutal act had been an assertion of his power, a final, desperate attempt to silence a voice he deemed unworthy. For Ali, however, it was the catalyst for a transformation that was as inevitable as the rising sun. In the silent space that followed, each person present bore witness not just to a personal conflict, but to a struggle that had been raging quietly for far too long. A struggle for dignity, for justice, and for the right to exist without fear of oppression. Thus, as the park stood in stunned silence, the confrontation that had begun as a simple demand for compliance had escalated into a defining moment. A moment where the forces of prejudice were met head-on by the enduring power of human spirit. The stage was now set for a battle that was as much about the soul of the community as it was about the individuals involved. In that charged atmosphere, the lines were drawn sharply, and the path ahead promised no easy resolution. The echoes of that violent strike would resound long after the moment had passed, marking the beginning of a struggle that would demand not only courage, but the collective will of all those who believed in a world where every life was valued equally. And so, with the baton still trembling in the grip of a man whose authority was beginning to crumble, the seeds of resistance were sown. The park, once a peaceful haven, had transformed into the arena of an unspoken revolution, one where the quiet dignity of a great fighter was about to challenge the very foundations of injustice. For a moment, there was only silence. The air hung heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. The sound of the baton striking Muhammad Ali's head still lingered in the ears of the gathered onlookers, an echo of violence that refused to dissipate. The world had slowed, as if nature itself was recoiling from the act of brutality it had just witnessed. The children playing nearby had gone quiet. The joggers had stopped mid-stride. Even the birds in the trees had ceased their singing. The entire park seemed to hold its breath. Muhammad Ali did not move. He sat there, still and composed, the same way he had sat in press conferences where he had declared his refusal to fight in an unjust war, the same way he had stood before the boxing world and reclaimed his title time and time again. Blood trickled down from where the baton had struck his scalp, running in thin, crimson rivulets along his temple. But there was no panic in his expression, no fear. His face remained calm, a portrait of quiet defiance. Then, slowly, deliberately, His hand rose. He touched his temple, his fingers tracing the wound, feeling the warmth of his own blood as it slid over his skin. There was no trembling in his fingers, no hesitation, just a slow, deliberate motion, as if he were memorizing the sensation, storing it away as another scar in the long, unbroken story of his life. The Baton strike had been meant as a final declaration of authority, a brutal punctuation mark at the end of Officer Kane's one-sided exchange. But as Ali lowered his bloodied hand, something in the air shifted. A subtle, nearly imperceptible tremor ran through the watching crowd, a collective realization passing through them like a ripple across still water. Muhammad Ali was about to stand up. The realization seemed to hit Officer Kane at the same time. His fingers tightened around the baton. His stance tensed. He had spent years enforcing his will on people through fear, through intimidation, through the weight of his badge and the power of his uniform. He had learned that when he struck, people recoiled. They cowered. They obeyed. But this man in front of him, this old fighter, was not cowering. Ali inhaled deeply, his chest rising, his lungs filling with the air of the moment. Then, with the same grace that had once allowed him to dance around the ring, he moved. Slowly, like a titan stirring from centuries of slumber, Muhammad Ali rose to his feet. His movement was neither rushed nor hesitant. It was measured, deliberate, controlled, every inch of his ascent carrying the weight of his history, his battles, his victories, and the unshakable knowledge of who he was. The crowd watched, transfixed. Even those who had only recognized the moment as a minor altercation a few minutes ago now felt the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Officer Kane's eyes widened. His grip on the baton went white-knuckled. Muhammad Ali was taller than him. Even in age, even with the tremors that Parkinson's had given him, the fighter's frame was still broad, still powerful, and now, as he stood, his presence became something more than physical. He towered in a way that had nothing to do with height, an unshakable presence, a force that could not be ignored or suppressed. The officer took a step back. He hadn't meant to. His body had reacted on its own. The movement was small, but it was noticed by everyone who had been watching. And, with that single step backward, the power dynamic had begun to shift. Ali did not raise his fists. He did not speak. He simply stood there, blood still running down the side of his face, and looked at Kane. And Kane felt it. For the first time in years, the officer felt a fear he could not explain. Not the fear of physical violence. He still had his weapon, his badge, his authority. No, this was something else. This was the fear of knowing that he had struck a man who could not be broken. That no matter how many times he had done this before, this time would be different. The murmur of the crowd grew. People were no longer just watching. They were reacting. Some whispered to one another, their voices tinged with awe. Others were holding up their phones, recording every moment. Someone in the back called out, "That's Muhammad Ali." Recognition rippled through the crowd. The name spread like wildfire, moving from one person to the next, transforming what had been a simple confrontation into something much larger. This was not just a man standing up to a police officer. This was Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer of all time, the man who had refused to be drafted into an unjust war, the man who had fought oppression in and out of the ring, and he had just been struck down by an officer of the law. Kane saw the shift happening before his eyes. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand. His face twisted with anger, with the desperate need to reassert his dominance over the situation. He raised the baton again. It was a mistake. Allie's hand moved before anyone could react. Not to punch, not to strike, but to catch. With the same reflexes that had once allowed him to slip punches from the deadliest fighters in the world, Allie's hand shot out and gripped the baton mid-swing. His fingers closed around the weapon with a strength that defied age, the veins in his forearm bulging slightly as he held it firm. The baton did not complete its arc. Kane's arm jerked to a halt, trapped in Ali's grip. His breath hitched in his throat. For the first time, he realized he had lost control. Muhammad Ali did not yank the baton away. He did not use it against Kane. He simply held it there, as if to demonstrate that he could take it if he wanted to, that this weapon meant nothing against him. Then, slowly, he let go. The baton dropped slightly as Kane staggered back, his face flushed with rage, with embarrassment, with the sinking realization that the power he had relied on was gone. A voice from the crowd rang out. "That's what you get." Another. "You picked the wrong man, officer." Kane's breath was ragged, his chest heaved. His mind screamed at him to do something, to take back the moment. But as he looked around, he saw that it was too late. The crowd had already made up its mind. He was no longer the enforcer of order. He was the villain in this story. His baton felt useless in his hand, and standing before him, unwavering, unbroken, Muhammad Ali remained. The Titan had risen, and the world was watching. The crowd had shifted. What had begun as idle curiosity had transformed into something greater, something more charged, more alive. The weight of history settled over the park, pressing down on every witness, forcing them to recognize that they were seeing something that could not be ignored. Officer Kane felt the shift too. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath uneven as he realized that the moment had slipped away from him. He was no longer in control. The quiet murmurs of the crowd had become a collective presence, a force stronger than the badge he wore or the baton he held. People had their phones raised, recording every second of the confrontation. Their eyes bore into him, not with fear, but with judgment. And yet, it was Muhammad Ali who dominated the moment. He had not raised a fist, he had not uttered a word in anger, but still he loomed over Kane, his towering presence undeniable. The wound on his head bled freely now, a stark contrast against his dark skin, but he stood as though it did not pain him at all. Kane clenched his jaw. His grip on the baton tightened again, his knuckles turning white. He knew the crowd was watching, but his pride screamed for him to do something, to reclaim his authority, to make Ali submit. But before he could act, the sound of rushing footsteps shattered the moment. 2 more officers appeared from the pathway leading to the park's main road. Their uniforms were the same as Kane's, but their expressions were different. One of them, a younger man with sharp features and wary eyes, slowed as he took in the scene. The other, older and more authoritative in his stance, narrowed his gaze the moment he saw Ali. The older officer stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth opened slightly, his brow furrowed in disbelief. His head tilted, as if needing a second look to confirm what his eyes were telling him. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he breathed out, "Is that Muhammad Ali?" The younger officer turned, his gaze darting between Kane and Ali, and his face went pale as realization dawned. Kane, standing in the center of it all, felt the heat of their stares. His skin burned with something deeper than anger, something closer to shame, though he would never name it as such. The older officer recovered quickly. He straightened, his face hardening as he assessed the situation. His eyes landed on the baton in Kane's grip, then flicked to the blood trailing down Ali's temple. His expression darkened. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was firm, demanding. Kane, still reeling, hesitated for half a second too long. The older officer took a step forward, his jaw tightening as he pointed at the baton in Kane's hand. "Put that away." His voice brooked no argument. Kane exhaled sharply through his nose, as if trying to contain his fury, but he obeyed. Slowly, stiffly, he lowered the baton and clipped it back onto his belt. The older officer turned to Ali. His posture was different now, not aggressive, not defensive, but respectful. He was looking at a legend, and he knew it. "Mr. Ali," he started carefully, almost uncertainly. "Are you all right?" Ali, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, finally moved. He reached up, touched the blood at his temple again, and then wiped his fingers on his white shirt. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. He turned his gaze toward the officer addressing him. His expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. The park had gone so silent that even the rustling leaves seemed muted, as if the world itself was waiting for his response. Then, finally, in a voice that carried the weight of his years, he spoke. "I'm still standing." The words were simple, but they landed like a hammer. The older officer exhaled, and something in his posture shifted. An acknowledgement, a quiet understanding. He turned back to Kane, his expression dark. "Explain yourself." Kane hesitated. His pride bristled, but he could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. His mind scrambled for a justification, anything that would make this seem like something other than what it was. But there was no excuse that would erase the truth. The evidence was everywhere. The phones recording, the blood on Ali's head. The sheer absurdity of it all, one of the greatest fighters to ever live, assaulted in broad daylight, in a park, by a man who had assumed he could get away with it. The older officer saw the hesitation. He had already made his decision. "Hand over your badge," he ordered. Kane's eyes snapped up. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "What? You heard me." The older officer's tone was sharper now, his patience thinning. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will take over from here." The younger officer, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. He had come to know Kane as an enforcer, someone who ruled with intimidation rather than justice. But here, now, stripped of his assumed power, Kane seemed small. Kane clenched his jaw. His eyes flicked to Ali, to the crowd, to the people still recording, their phones capturing every humiliating second. He wanted to resist, to argue, to fight back. But he knew it was over. With a tense, jerking motion, he reached up and unpinned his badge. He yanked it from his chest, his movement stiff with barely contained rage, and shoved it toward the older officer. The officer took it without a word. The crowd began to stir. Murmurs of satisfaction rippled through them, as if justice, imperfect as it was, had been served. Someone in the back clapped once, a single sharp sound that seemed to trigger a slow, growing wave of applause. Kane's face darkened further. He turned sharply, his boots grinding against the pavement, and stormed away. The tension in the air began to dissipate, though the moment was far from forgotten. The older officer turned back to Ali. "We'll get you medical attention." Ali, however, shook his head. "I'm fine." His voice was steady, unshaken. The officer hesitated but did not press the issue. Instead, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Ali glanced toward the crowd. Many of them were still watching him, their expressions a mixture of awe and admiration. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their gratitude, their hope. He did not give a speech. He did not bask in the moment. He simply turned and began walking. The crowd parted for him, their applause still echoing in the background. The fight was over, and Muhammad Ali was still standing. The echoes of the crowd's applause faded as Muhammad Ali walked away from the scene. The world around him, once charged with tension, had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm. Joggers resumed their strides, children's laughter cautiously returned to the air, and life in the park slowly regained its pace. But something had changed, something subtle yet undeniable. People whispered as Ali passed, their gazes lingering on him with newfound reverence. Some recorded his retreating figure, knowing that this moment would not simply vanish into the folds of history. It had been witnessed, captured, and would be remembered. The great Muhammad Ali, the man who had once defied the government, had stood tall again today, not in a boxing ring, not with fists raised, but with the same unbreakable resolve that had always defined him. He could feel the warm trickle of blood drying on his temple. His body, though weathered by time and illness, still carried the echoes of his past battles. But there was no trembling in his steps, no hesitation in his posture. Even at this stage of his life, he refused to bow. Near the fountain at the center of the park, a small boy stood with wide eyes, clutching a notebook against his chest. His dark curls bounced slightly as he took a cautious step forward, staring at Ali as if trying to summon the courage to speak. His mother stood behind him, hands resting gently on his shoulders, her expression filled with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Ali noticed them. He slowed, his gaze settling on the boy with a softness that contrasted sharply with the unyielding presence he had exuded just moments ago. The child, no older than 10, hesitated before holding out his notebook. His voice was small but determined. "Can I have your autograph, Mr. Ali?" Ali looked at him for a moment, studying his face, the unshaken wonder in his eyes, the hopeful way he extended the notebook as if presenting something sacred. The great fighter smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there, warm and genuine. With a slow, steady movement, he reached out and took the notebook. The boy held his breath as Ali flipped it open to a blank page. A pen was quickly offered. By the mother, by another stranger, it didn't matter. Ali took it between his fingers, his grip steady despite the tremors that Parkinson's had gifted him. He pressed the tip to the page, writing slowly but with deliberate care. When he finished, he handed the notebook back. The boy stared at the signature as if it were made of gold. Ali placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and leaned in just slightly. "Be strong," he said. The boy nodded, clutching the notebook even tighter. His mother exhaled, as if only now allowing herself to process what had just happened. "Thank you," she murmured, "for standing up today, for everything." Ali gave her a small nod before straightening. His expression remained calm, but there was something behind his eyes, something deep, something old. He had heard words like these before. People had thanked him many times for refusing to be drafted, for speaking against injustice, for never wavering in who he was. And yet, no matter how many times it happened, he always understood that his battles were never just his own. With a final glance at the mother and her son, he turned and continued walking. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park. The golden light caught the edges of the trees, painting the leaves in soft hues of orange and amber. The air was cooling, the day making its slow descent into evening. Ali did not need to look back to know that people were still watching, but he was not walking for them. He was walking for something greater, for the boy who now held a piece of his legacy in a notebook, for the countless others who would hear of what happened today, for the understanding that no matter how many years passed, no matter how much his body slowed, his spirit would never be broken. He had been struck down today, but Muhammad Ali was still standing, and the world would never forget. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and don't forget to share this video with others. See you in the next one.